Hi, I'm John Story. Welcome to another episode of The War Story. Today's episode is going to follow up on some of the stuff I talked about on the episode on nuclear weapons and whether nuclear weapons can deter China. Today I'm going to explore an idea that you don't really hear much about in the media. In fact, I'm not sure anyone's mentioned it. And as an alternative way to deter China from invading Taiwan. Now, turn on the news, open the papers, a lot of stuff about China, a lot of threatening language coming out of China to invade Taiwan. So a lot of people are thinking about how can we avoid a war? Because if they invade and America get involved, this could be World War III. There is an idea that I've got for deterring China from invading Taiwan. And the reason I'm surprised no one has raised it is that this strategy, when used in the 20th century, has a 100% success rate. It's pretty rare for any military strategy to be 100% successful. And the strategy is effectively guerrilla insurgency against a foreign occupying power. Every single time in the 20th century when this has happened, the foreign occupying power leaves in the end. So guerrilla insurgency is terrorism, ambushing, small-scale firefights, kidnapping, bombs, detonations, all the sort of stuff that you do against an enemy because you're not big and strong enough to take on their military forces directly. Guerrilla insurgency was used against a lot of the European colonial powers after the Second World War. And in every single situation, those colonial European powers left in the end. So whether it was the French in Indochina, the French in Algeria, the British in Palestine, the British in Kenya, Portuguese in Mozambique and Angola, the Belgians in the Congo, and all these other places. To be fair, sometimes the European powers just left without a fight, like the British left India without a fight. But when there was a fight, in the end, the European powers left. It's not just, weak European democracies that have left. The United States left Vietnam. After a long drawn-out guerrilla insurgency in South Vietnam, they left. More recently, in Iraq, the Americans ended up leaving after a long insurgency. They came back briefly invited back by the Iraqi government to help fight ISIS. In the news right now is Americans leaving Afghanistan after a 20-year guerrilla insurgency. It's not just democracies. The Soviet Union left Afghanistan after a 10-year or so guerrilla insurgency against them. When the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia, they ended up leaving because the country became difficult to manage. Now, I'm not saying that all guerrilla insurgencies are 100% successful. It's really important to note that foreign occupying power, insurgencies against foreign powers in the 20th century were 100% successful. Guerrilla insurgencies against native, homegrown, local governments, it's more of a mixed bag. You had some successes. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party mounted a guerrilla warfare against a nationalist government in China in the Chinese Civil War and ended up winning, taking power, and the nationalist government wasn't a foreign government, it was a local homegrown government. The Arab Spring saw the removal of some local governments in Libya and Tunisia and elsewhere, Egypt. So it's had some success, but more often it's more mixed. So quite often they're crushed completely when fighting the native governments, or they're drawn out sort of draws, if you like, or the insurgency just sort of peters out. It's just sort of never really defeated, but never really goes anywhere. At best, sometimes it might be a division of the country. So the insurgents might be able to take control of one part of the country, the government remains in control of another part of the country, and that's as good as the insurgents do. Far more checkered history. In fact, most of the time they're not completely successful in removing an unpopular government. Of course, there can be coups or rebellions that quickly remove a government, but I'm not talking about a a purge in the middle of the night, removing some president, replacing him with someone else. I'm talking about a military resistance. So guerrilla insurgency itself isn't, perfectly useful, but it's very useful against foreign occupying powers. So why is that? Well, the reality is that the foreign occupying power is rarely willing to commit too many resources in defending the colonial possession or whatever it is. In fact, they might have gotten into the colonial business in the first place to make money, but when the insurgents are launching attacks and mounting ambushes, that's costly. You need to increase your defence of the country. Soldiers need to be paid. That's expensive. After a while, it's like, just too expensive. Let's get out of here. Deaths of foreign soldiers become very unpopular on the home front. We saw this in Vietnam and the Iraq insurgency. After a while, people get really reluctant and say, hey, why are my boys dying for some country that's, half a world away? Basically, foreign powers, after a while, they're willing to cut their losses and leave. That's not the same for local homegrown governments. Quite often the local homegrown governments, however unpopular they may be, in fact, the more unpopular, the worse it is, they have nowhere to go. To them, it's victory or death quite often. If the insurgents win, they've got nowhere to go, no country to retreat to, and it could be their very lives at stake. So they'll use whatever methods at their power for as long as possible to hang on to power. And when you've got the power of a state behind you, that means you can buy weapons and raise taxes and that sort of thing. Generally, they're more powerful than the insurgents. The insurgents are fighting that way because they're weak. But if you're weak and you can cause pinprick damage for long enough against someone who has a finite amount of resources they're willing to commit to the fight, the foreign power leaves in the end. Local powers, not so much. Now, I said it was 100% successful. There's probably two exceptions. So the first one is the Chechen insurgency. So the Chechens were able to remove Russians from Chechen territory for a while in the 90s. Then the Russians came back and sort of crushed them, and they're still there now. So you could say that insurgency didn't work, but you also have to question whether the Russians were a true foreign power. I mean, it had been Russian-controlled territory for 150 years. There was a lot of, migration and whatnot. So, I'm sure the Chechens were labeling the Russians as foreign power, but it's not a perfect example. The other one is Israel. Israelis conquered territory during the various Arab-Israeli wars and holds on to some of that territory. It's not a perfect example though either. For example, the Israelis did leave the Gaza Strip, so you could sort of say the insurgency has kind of worked. But they hang on to the Golan Heights, they hang on to the West Bank. But probably it's the exception that proves the rule, because I think the Israelis see the West Bank and the Golan Heights as fundamental to their security. They're neighbouring countries. Israel's a small country. If an aggressive power were to take control of the West Bank, you'd be able to divide Israel in half easily. So I think the Israelis are probably willing to commit more to the fight. Okay, well, that brings us to Taiwan. And I just want to read something from a book called Atomic Obsessions by John Mueller. It's a good book. It's about 10 years old or something, about over-reliance, over-emphasis on nuclear weapons in war. I just thought I'd quote from his book because I thought it's sort of insightful. In the wake of the Iraq disaster, an invasion by the ever-threatening Americans can probably now be credibly deterred simply by maintaining a trained and well-armed cadre of a few thousand troops dedicated to and capable of inflicting endless irregular warfare on the hapless and increasingly desperate invaders. So what the context he's talking about is Iran. Iran rightly feared that they might be next on the American list after America invaded Iraq. George W. Bush called them part of the axis of evil. is America going to invade Iran? And that put a spur to Iran's nuclear weapons program, thinking that if we've got nuclear weapons, we might be able to deter any invasion. And I think what John Mueller's saying is right, that if you really want to deter an American invasion, train a force of a few thousand soldiers in irregular warfare, IEDs, terrorism, ambushes, covert operations, that sort of thing. That can recruit people from the local population and can maintain that indefinitely and announce that in advance. Not, in a press conference, but through back channels, say, hey, we've got this special elite force that are going to take to the hills, blend into the population, and make your life a misery if you come. The 20th century would suggest that that is your best chance of survival. Small armies get beaten by big armies. Small insurgency forces tend to wear away at big forces eventually. Now, let's move away from Iran. Is this a solution for Taiwan? Should Taiwan, instead of be thinking about how can I have a conventional deterrence against China, very difficult when China is such a rich, powerful country, should I think about nuclear weapons? That could be very dangerous. Not saying those things shouldn't be on the table. What I'm saying is they should also, as a bit of an insurance policy, be training a force of soldiers that can undertake a guerrilla insurgency. From the day of a Chinese invasion, take to the hills, blend into the population, start mounting attacks. I've got no doubt that a Chinese military invasion of Taiwan would be seen as foreign invaders. I know the Taiwanese are Chinese as well, but I don't think there'd be any doubt they would be seen as foreign invaders. And the 20th century would tell you that if you make life an absolute misery for the foreign invaders, they'll leave in the end. I'm not saying this is an easy solution. It could take decades and regularly does take decades. And I'm not saying it would be pain-free. Foreign powers or unpopular governments facing a guerrilla insurgency tend to resort to repression or reprisals at some stage. They'll give it a go. Look at the Chinese government. Look what they're doing to the Uyghur people. Look at their face recognition technology that they're exporting to other authoritarian governments. Their social credit system. The Chinese are pretty good at repression. So I'm not saying it'll be easy, but it's a lot easier to do that in China when you're the local government than it is to implement it when you're an unpopular foreign power. So it could be painful, could take a long time. The Chinese are brilliant at repression, but I think it should be on the table. Announce you're creating this force and just plant in the seeds of the minds of the Chinese Communist Party that you might be able to win militarily, but are you ultimately going to be able to win politically? Are you going to be able to hold this country? And if that raises a question mark in the minds of the Chinese, maybe that's enough to deter them from doing it. So I just thought that was an interesting little discussion on Taiwan and deterrence and some lateral ways of thinking and military history, and a chance to plug this book. I don't know John Mueller, but I thought it was a really good book. Yeah, let me know what you think. Hit like, hit subscribe, leave a comment. Is there something I missed? Do you disagree with me? Do you think that would be a dreadful idea to invite those reprisals and repression on the Taiwanese people? Is there a better way to deter China? Let's continue the conversation and catch you next time.